Dean Martin. The name alone still floats in the memory of anyone old enough to remember the glow of Hollywood's golden years. He wasn't just a singer or a movie star or the laid-back member of the Rat Pack who always seemed like he had the world figured out. Dean Martin was a feeling. He was the warm smile at the end of a long day, the soft chuckle in a crowded room, the easy voice that made life feel lighter. But behind that relaxed charm was a man who had learned to hide his heart carefully. He wasn't cold. He was cautious. He had lived long enough to know that the world could be loud and cruel and unpredictable. And so he built a gentle wall around the parts of himself that mattered. Yet even the strongest wall has one open door. And Dean Martin had one person in his life who walked straight through. Without knocking, his son, Dean Paul Martin, lovingly called Dino Jr., the golden boy who seemed to carry all the hope and pride of his father's universe. To anyone who knew the Martin family, it was obvious that Dino wasn't just another celebrity child raised in privilege. He was the real thing, handsome in a way that made people pause, talented in ways that made even his own father shake his head in admiration, athletic, disciplined, charming, and blessed with the kind of energy that drew people toward him. Before most young men his age had even figured out what they wanted to do with their lives, Dino had already succeeded in 3 of them. He played tennis at Wimbledon. He acted in films and television. He played in a rock band that was actually popular. And above all else, he became a pilot in the California Air National Guard, flying F-4 Phantom jets with the kind of confidence and bravery that made his father glow with pride. But for Dean, the achievements didn't matter as much as the boy behind them. Because when Dean Martin looked at his son, he didn't see the glamour or the applause or the uniform. He saw a reflection of everything he wished he had been: stronger, braver, more grounded, more purposeful. A son who somehow carried both his father's charm and the discipline Dean always admired in others. They weren't just father and son. They were best friends. They laughed together, played golf together, and understood one another in a silent, natural way that needed no words. Dean Martin, who kept almost everyone at arm's length and trusted very few people in his life, lowered every emotional barrier he had ever built when Dino was around. With Dino, he could be himself, not the star, not the comedian, not the man in the tuxedo holding a glass for show, but a simple, loving father. Dino was the anchor that kept Dean from drifting too far into the noise of fame. He was the reminder that life was bigger than Hollywood. When Dean felt overwhelmed by attention, exhausted by show business, or drained by the expectations that came with being Dean Martin, all he had to do was look at his son in that flight suit, ready to serve his country, and he felt a pride no audience could ever give him. He would point to Dino's photograph and say with genuine humility, "That's my boy. He flies jets. I just sing songs." Behind the joke was the simple truth: Dean adored his son. And that deep, quiet love is what made March 21st, 1987, the day everything changed. The day the world shifted under Dean Martin's feet. The day fate exposed the raw, fragile truth behind all the coolness. A man is never ready to lose his child. That Saturday began like any other in Los Angeles. The air was calm. The sun was soft. Nothing hinted at the storm that was growing 30, 40, 50 miles away in the San Bernardino Mountains. On Mount San Gorgonio, the tallest peak in Southern California, a violent snowstorm had taken over the sky. Winds tore through the mountainsides like unseen hands. Clouds thickened into a blinding white wall. Snow fell so heavily it erased the horizon and swallowed the world in silence. It was the kind of weather that made even experienced pilots uneasy. But duty does not wait for perfect skies. Captain Dean Paul Martin and his weapons systems officer, Captain Ramon Ortiz, prepared for what was supposed to be a routine training mission. Their aircraft, an F-4C Phantom, was a roaring metal beast capable of reaching incredible speeds. A machine built for precision and danger. Dino had flown missions harder than this. He had trained in conditions much worse. He had no reason to believe the mountain would be his final audience. Meanwhile, Dean Martin was at home in Beverly Hills, likely watching television, maybe a golf match, maybe an old western, completely unaware that the quiet around him was about to explode into a heartbreak he would never escape. At 1:52 p.m., Dino's jet radioed air traffic control requesting a left turn to Avoid the towering wall of clouds ahead. The controller approved it. But somewhere in the mix of violent winds, blinding snow, and the disorienting whiteout, something went terribly wrong. The jet didn't turn away from the mountain. It turned toward it, at speeds over 400 miles per hour. With visibility near zero, there was no time to react. No moment for fear, no chance for survival. One instant they were cutting through the sky, and the next, the Phantom met the granite side of Mount San Gorgonio with catastrophic force. The explosion was swallowed by the storm. The mountain kept the secret. And back in Beverly Hills, Dean Martin still didn't know that the brightest part of his life had been extinguished. Miles above the snow, when the radar blip disappeared from the screens at March Air Force Base, controllers called out for Phantom 6. Static answered back. That static held the beginning of Dean Martin's nightmare. The call to Dean didn't come immediately. First came uncertainty, then concern, then the dreadful phrase no parent ever wants to hear. Mr. Martin, your son's plane is missing. Missing. The word that gives a sliver of hope while carrying the weight of doom. For 3 days, the storm refused to let search teams anywhere near the crash site. Helicopters were grounded. Rescue crews were pushed back by winds and avalanches and visibility that barely allowed them to see their own boots. And during those 3 days, Dean Martin entered a private hell that no camera ever captured and no biography ever fully described. He didn't eat. He barely slept. He chain-smoked cigarette after cigarette until the room he sat in was thick with haze. Friends called. Some came to sit with him. Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Jerry Lewis, all reaching out, all trying to offer comfort, but Dean barely responded. He wasn't Dean Martin anymore. He was a father waiting for a miracle, pacing through his house like a man trapped between hope and dread. He prayed, something he rarely did. He whispered bargains into the air. Take the fame, take the fortune, take everything. Just give me my boy. But the storm did not break for him. The mountain did not move. While search teams tried and failed to reach the site, Dean sat at home imagining every possible scenario in which his son survived. Maybe Dino had ejected. Maybe he was sitting somewhere on the snow, alive but cold, waiting to be rescued. Dean clung to these images with the desperation of a man drowning. Every hour without news was another blade cutting deeper into his sanity. Finally, when the storm relented, the helicopters lifted off. They found the scars on the mountain. They found the wreckage. And they found no parachute, no signs of survival, no chance of hope. When the confirmation finally reached Dean Martin that his son had died instantly upon impact, there was no dramatic outburst, no collapse, no screaming. He simply went quiet. The light behind his eyes, the soft, mischievous spark that had charmed the world for decades, dimmed until it vanished completely. He hung up the phone and sat in silence, staring at nothing. In that moment, something inside him broke in a way that would never heal again. The funeral arrived like a dark fog that settled over every corner of Dean Martin's life. It was one of those days where even the sunshine felt wrong, where the bright California sky felt almost disrespectful to the grief that followed him like a shadow. Limousines lined the street. Photographers hovered at a distance. Famous faces filled the aisles of the chapel. But none of that mattered to Dean, because grief has a strange way of making the entire world look blurry, as if someone smeared a tear across the lens. He moved through the day like a figure carved from stone, stiff, silent, and disconnected. His dark glasses weren't the trademark of a performer now. They were a shield, hiding eyes swollen from sleepless nights and a soul exhausted beyond measure. People approached him with gentle words. He was a hero. He didn't suffer. He lived a beautiful life. But their voices sounded like echoes, distant and hollow. Dean nodded politely, but he wasn't really there. His body stood with the mourners, but his mind was trapped somewhere on that cold mountainside, where his son had spent his final moment. The military honors only deepened the weight in his chest. When the American flag was folded and placed into his hands, something inside him trembled. It wasn't pride. It wasn't even sorrow. It was the unbearable realization that this perfectly folded triangle was all he had left of the boy he had raised, the boy who used to run through the house, who used to laugh at his jokes, who used to call him dad, with that effortless affection only a son can give. The bugle played taps, that lonely piercing melody that always seems to sound like a farewell echoing across eternity. As the final note faded, Dean gently touched the casket, his fingers lingering as if he were stroking his son's hair one last time. Some who stood nearby later said they thought they saw his lips move, as if he whispered a private message meant for Dino alone. No one knew what he said, and honestly, no one needed to. Some grief is too deep for words. When the funeral ended, the world expected Dean Martin to return to being Dean Martin. They expected him to get back on stage, crack jokes, flash that lazy smile, and keep being the man who made millions of people feel like life was a little sweeter. But Dean didn't belong to the world anymore. He belonged to his sorrow. He returned to his home on Mountain Drive, shut the gates, and slipped into a kind of silence that frightened even the people who knew him best. He didn't rage. He didn't weep publicly. He simply shut down. The radio stayed off. The phone went unanswered. Friends knocked on his door, tried to take him to dinner, tried to bring him company. But he always declined with the same quiet, polite sadness. He wasn't angry at them. He just didn't know how to be himself anymore. The man who once lit up every room he entered had become a man who barely lit up his own hallway. Days blurred together. Nights felt endless. He developed a routine not because he wanted one, but because grief forces a person to survive in the simplest ways possible. He would wake up late, sit with a cup of coffee that went cold in his hands, and stare at the television without really watching it. Old westerns filled his afternoons, because in westerns the world was straightforward. There were good men, bad men, and justice that always found its way home. Westerns were predictable, comforting in their simplicity. In those films, the world made sense. Death had meaning. Heroes lived with honor. Dean needed a world like that because his own world no longer made any sense at all. People around him noticed the transformation. They saw a man who once lived with charm and ease slowly fading into the background of his own life. Some called it depression. Others called it heartbreak. But anyone who truly understood him knew it was neither. It was grief so profound it had become a companion, a constant presence that lived beside him, walked with him, breathed with him. In those first years after Dino's death, Dean aged not by months, but by decades. His walk slowed. His shoulders sagged. His smile, when it appeared at all, was thin and tired, like a candle burning at the end of its wick. Even his legendary coolness, the thing that had defined him for so long, felt different. It wasn't stylish now. It was protective, like a blanket wrapped around a wound. Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. saw what was happening and refused to let their friend slip away without a fight. They knew Dean better than anyone. They had shared stages, spotlights, and secrets. They had laughed together in smoky rooms, performed for packed crowds, and lived lives most people only dream about. They believed, truly believed, that if they could just get Dean back on stage, if they could surround him with music, applause, and brotherhood, he might find a spark of life again. And so they planned a massive reunion tour, a comeback. The Great Rat Pack reunited. The world was excited. Tickets sold instantly. It was supposed to be a celebration, a revival, a moment of magic for all three legends. Dean agreed, not because he wanted the applause or the attention, but because he didn't want to disappoint his friends. He had always been loyal. He always showed up when someone needed him. Even now, hollowed out by grief, he tried to be the Dean Martin people remembered. But when the tour began, it became clear almost immediately that the man who once owned the stage no longer existed. In Oakland, in Vancouver, in Chicago, he sang, but the humor was gone. The spark was missing. He forgot lyrics. He made jokes with a heaviness that audiences had never heard from him. He flicked ashes from his cigarette onto the stage with a look of fatigue, as if the entire world had become too heavy to carry. Frank tried everything. He nudged him, encouraged him, reminded him that the crowd loved him. But love no longer felt like enough. When the applause roared, Dean didn't feel energized. He felt empty. Performing became an act of emotional labor he couldn't sustain. And then, in Chicago, something inside him simply snapped. He turned to Frank during the performance and quietly said, "I want to go home." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was just honest. The man who had entertained millions for decades had nothing left to give. Moments later, Dean walked off the stage, left the building, went straight to the airport, and flew home. The news said he quit because of kidney pain. But everyone close to him knew the truth. His soul was refusing to pretend anymore. The world kept spinning without him. The tour continued with replacements. But Dean Martin wasn't interested in the world anymore. He didn't seek fame, fortune, or a comeback. He embraced solitude like a man finally admitting defeat. Yet it wasn't bitterness. It wasn't resentment. It was simply exhaustion, the kind that only a broken heart can understand. Dean Martin spent the early 1990s like a man walking through a thick fog. He was alive, yes, but only in the way a candle is technically, still burning even when the flame is too small to warm a room. His friends tried to pull him back. Hollywood tried to honor him into feeling alive again. Sinatra called him repeatedly, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, sometimes heartbroken, but nothing reached him anymore, because the only voice that could pull him out of that darkness had been silenced on a mountainside nearly a decade before. People often imagine grief as something that hits like a storm, loud, violent, and overwhelming. But the grief that lived in Dean Martin was different. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, quiet, and carried like a weight hidden in the lining of a suit. The public could not see it, but he felt it with every step. He moved through his days like someone who wasn't searching for life anymore, just waiting gently for permission to leave. And yet, he was never bitter, never angry. If anything, he became softer, more nostalgic, more thoughtful. He treated people with a warmth that surprised, even those who had known him for years. He didn't want fame. He didn't want stages. He didn't want crowds. All he wanted was silence. The same silence where he could still feel the echo of his son's laughter. As December of 1995 approached, Dean began spending most days in his Beverly Hills home. Sometimes he would sit near the window for hours, staring out at the sky with an expression people described as peaceful, almost relieved. His staff would say later that it was as if he was waiting for something or someone. He barely spoke, but when he did, his words were always gentle. There was no fear in him anymore, no confusion, no panic, just acceptance. The funny thing about the human heart is that it knows when the end is coming. It prepares itself quietly, almost politely. And Dean's heart, after carrying so much love and so much loss, finally began letting go. On Christmas morning, a day he once filled with parties, gifts, music, and laughter, he slipped away quietly, the same way he lived, soft-spoken, calm, and without demanding attention. No final speech, no dramatic gesture, just peace. The doctors said he died of respiratory failure, but those who truly knew him said something different. They said he died of a heartbreak that never healed. They said that losing Dino Jr. didn't just break a part of him. It took the part of him that kept him alive. And for Dean Martin, the world after that loss was simply a place he was passing through until he could finally rest. Hollywood reacted with the kind of grief reserved for legends. Newspapers printed tributes. Fans across the country played his songs and watched his films. Sinatra cried privately and didn't speak to anyone for hours. Old friends gathered to remember his jokes, his charm, his gentle smile. But beneath all the public mourning, there was a quieter understanding that Dean Martin had been gone long before. December 25, 1995. His soul had left the night his son's plane, vanished into the mountains. And yet, that is not the end of his story. Because a legacy like Dean Martin's doesn't disappear. It doesn't fade. It doesn't end with loss. It lives in the music that still plays in diners, in the holiday specials families still watch every year, in the effortless charm that younger generations still try and fail to imitate. It lives in the way he made people feel comfortable, relaxed, at ease, like they were in the presence of someone who asked for nothing and gave everything. But most of all, Dean's legacy lives in the quiet truth that love, even when it breaks you, is still love. And the depth of his sorrow was proof of the depth of his devotion. His son didn't just shape his life, he shaped his heart. And when that heart finally stopped, it wasn't a tragedy. It was a reunion. They say a father should never have to bury his child. And they're right. But they also say that love is stronger than death. And in Dean Martin's case, that might be the truest part of his entire story. Because even after the fame, the lights, the applause, the glamour, the real Dean Martin was not the entertainer the world worshipped. The real Dean Martin was a father who loved one boy more deeply than the world ever understood. And in the very last chapter of his life, he wasn't dying. He was going home.